Have you ever stopped to think about the true meaning behind Isaac's sacrifice? What really happened in that moment of extreme faith that challenged even the laws of reason? Many people know the story, but few understand the hidden mysteries in that act of obedience to God and the powerful lessons that still resonate today. Today, we'll explore Isaac's sacrifice like never before. You'll discover aspects you've probably never heard of and understand how this story connects to something much greater than we might have imagined. Get ready to dive into one of the Bible's most enigmatic episodes and uncover the spiritual secrets that could transform your own life. Stay with us until the end, because what you're about to learn might change your perspective forever. The warm breeze of the night gently blew across the plains of Ur of the Chaldeans, carrying the scent of fires and incense burning in the temples of pagan gods. The city glowed under the light of torches and lanterns, reflecting the splendor of a rich and powerful civilization. But inside a humble dwelling, one man was restless. His name was Abram. Unlike the other inhabitants of Ur, he found no meaning in the stone statues, the sacrifices to the mute gods, or the superstitions that guided the lives of his fellow countrymen. Inside him was a thirst for something greater, a truth that transcended the limits of what his eyes could see. He gazed at the starry sky, searching for answers. Then the voice came. A deep, majestic, unmistakable sound filled the silence of the night. It wasn't a human sound, nor the distant roar of a storm. It was a presence, a certainty. Abram. The voice echoed, firm and full of authority. He felt his heart race. His knees wavered. But there was peace in that presence, a peace that no offering or ritual could provide. Leave your country, your relatives, and your father's house, and go to the land I will show you. The words vibrated within him. It wasn't just a call to depart, it was a grand promise. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name famous, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Abram's heart raced. A great nation? His name would be remembered forever? His life, once ordinary, would take a turn that would influence the destiny of humanity? But something seemed to contradict all of this. He had no children. His wife, Sarai, was barren and no longer young. How could his descendants be as numerous as the stars if there was not even one heir? The thoughts raced through his mind, but there was no room for doubt. He knew. This wasn't a dream or an illusion. The one speaking to him was the true God. And so, before the vastness of the sky and the promises that seemed impossible, Abram made a decision that would forever change history. He believed. And his journey of faith was just beginning. After the heavenly revelation, Abram found himself facing an unexpected challenge. The great promise God had made sounded like a symphony of hope and courage. However, the path he was to follow was still uncertain and cloudy. Leave your land, and go to where I will show you. There was no clear destination, no mapped-out plan. Only an unshakable trust in the voice that called him. Ur of the Chaldeans, his hometown, was a vibrant center of commerce and culture. Its streets were filled with bustling markets, and most people worshipped the local gods. The idea of leaving behind everything he knew, his family, his home, even the status he had, seemed insane. But the strength of the promise was greater than any doubt. Abram looked at Sarai, his wife, and saw the same concern reflected in her eyes. Together, they had dreamed for so long of the stability, peace, and comfort of life in Ur. Yet, something within him pushed him to obey. And so, he turned to her and said, "Let's go. We will trust what has been told to us." With quiet courage, Sarai nodded. They prepared for the journey with little baggage and hearts full of faith. Abram's nephew, Lot, who had always been a constant companion in his life, decided to join them, as did their servants and shepherds. The destination was in God's hands. The caravan set out in silence. Each step seemed to carry the weight of a new beginning. As they traveled through deserts and mountains, Abram reflected on the deep meaning of it all. He didn't know where they were going, but he knew they weren't alone. The Lord would guide them. The scorching heat of the desert and the barren landscape didn't make his faith waver. On the contrary, each day that passed on his journey, he built altars at strategic locations, markers of his devotion to the God who had called him to something greater. There, among the stones and the wind, he prayed and reaffirmed his trust. Faith in a future he couldn't yet see, but felt in his soul as something certain was stronger than ever. However, the weeks and months of travel made the weight of uncertainty increasingly clear. Abram and Sarai, despite all their faith, couldn't help but wonder. Where were they going? And why hadn't they had children yet? The promise of a great descent seemed distant, and time was running out for them. But as much as the challenges troubled them, they didn't give up. They knew the Lord would guide them to the end. Abram and his family's long journey took them to distant and unknown lands, each one more desolate than the last. The golden dunes of the desert stretched endlessly, and the towering mountains that had seemed so small in the distance became almost impassable barriers as they drew closer. The promised land, which God had shown in his promise, was still far away and shrouded in mystery. As the days passed and the difficulties mounted, Abram's faith did not waver, but there were moments of weakness. The burning sun scorched his back, and the relentless wind raised dust that got into his eyes and blurred his vision. Sarai, also tired, seemed to age with each passing day. The fear that the promise of descendants would never be fulfilled began to gnaw at her spirit. She and Abram were no longer young, and the desert silence was broken only by the steps of their animals and the sound of their prayers. But despite everything, Abram kept the flame of hope alive. At each stop, he built an altar, not just as a symbol of devotion, but as an anchor amidst the uncertainties surrounding him. He made sacrifices, prayed, and sought to hear God's voice, but it seemed distant, almost inaudible amidst the roaring wind. One day, while walking alone through a quiet plain, Abram found himself facing a sea of stars in the night sky. He stopped and, with his eyes fixed on the constellations, he heard the promise echoing once more in his mind. Your descendants will be like the stars in the sky, countless. He knelt, his hands touching the cold earth. The deep silence around him seemed to confirm that the Lord was with him, even though he was not visible, even though he was not immediate. And although his body was exhausted and frustration sometimes took hold of his spirit, he knew that, as long as he had faith, the promise would still be possible. Sarai, also weary from waiting, began to question more openly. Where is the son God promised us? She wondered. Doubt began to weigh on her, and the silent glances exchanged between her and Abram conveyed a mutual understanding that perhaps the promise would take longer than they had imagined. But it wasn't just time that was against them. The land they were in, Canaan, was still far from a prosperous place. Herbs were scarce, water was rare, and while the sun burned during the day, the night brought a piercing cold. They were in a foreign land, without deep roots, and loneliness became a burden. One morning, as the group marched, a strong wind raised a cloud of sand that obscured the horizon. Abram, looking around, couldn't help but feel the loneliness of the moment. Where was the promised land? Where were the answers to their questions? But deep within his being, one voice could not be ignored. Don't give up. It was the voice of God, gentle yet firm. And even though the sun had not yet fulfilled its promise to warm his land, Abram knew that faith would guide him until the end of the journey. His unshakable trust was the fuel that drove him forward, no matter how long it took or how difficult it was. God had spoken, and he would fulfill his word. As Abram and his family continued their journey through Canaan, a distant but significant event was about to reshape the world they knew. Although they were isolated in their walk of faith, the impact of what had happened in other parts of the land was inescapable. Long before Abram, in a forgotten age, humanity had gathered in one place. The city of Babel, in the heart of Mesopotamia, was building a tower that defied the very heavens. The structure, immense and grand, was more than an architectural wonder. It was a statement of pride and human attempts to reach the power and greatness of God. Its builders sought to make a name for themselves, so they would not be scattered across the earth. They desired to build a structure that would reach the heavens, a tower that would challenge the divine order. But human arrogance never goes unnoticed. God, observing the efforts of Babel, knew that the unity of man could be used for evil if God's sovereignty was ignored. And so, he decided to intervene, breaking the common language that united all the peoples. Suddenly, the words that were once shared became incomprehensible. People who had once worked together now found themselves in conflict, unable to understand one another. The construction of the tower ceased, and the pride of man dissolved into a sea of confusion. God scattered the peoples across the earth, dividing them into nations with different languages. Those who had worked on the tower were forced to separate and go to new lands, and the great unity of humanity was broken. Babel, the city that had sought to reach the heavens, became a symbol of the failed attempt to defy him. For Abram and his family, the echo of this event seemed distant, but the consequence was unfolding before them. The world, once united under a common language, was now a tapestry of cultures, peoples, and divided territories. But God's plan was in motion. As the world fragmented and nations emerged, the Lord looked at Abram and chose that man, called Exalted Father, to restore the spiritual unity that had been lost in the attempt of Babel. God had made a covenant with Abram, promising that he would become the father of a great nation, and through him, all nations would be blessed. The very fact that God chose Abram at this moment was no accident. It was a direct action to restore what human pride had shattered. Abram did not fully understand the implications of this divine plan, but his faith was grounded in the certainty that amid the scattering of peoples and the divisions of languages, he was the chosen one to bring hope to humanity. And so, while the ruins of the Tower of Babel symbolized human failure, Abram saw before him the opportunity to be a beacon of faith and restoration for a broken world. Abram and his family finally arrived in the promised land, Canaan, but contrary to their expectations, the land was not prepared to welcome them with abundance. The fields were dry, and the pastures were scarce. The relentless climate and lack of food became a constant worry. Abram knew that, in times of difficulty, faith would be his greatest ally. But the physical needs were urgent and were beginning to weigh heavily on him and his family. The unyielding sun of the region made the journey harder with each passing day. Dust rose under the hooves of the animals and the tired feet of the family, and the food they had brought quickly ran out. Water became harder to find, and the days of scarcity threatened to shake their confidence. He knew that God's promise of a great offspring and the promised land was still in place, but the current situation seemed desolate. After weeks of unsuccessfully searching for a solution, Abram made a difficult but necessary decision. He decided to go down to Egypt, a prosperous country where food was abundant and the fertile land could ensure the survival of his family. Egypt was known for its great wealth and the Nile, which brought life to its arid lands. Even though it was a distant land, full of strangers and dangers, it was the only viable option to prevent his family from succumbing to hunger. The journey to Egypt was not simple. Crossing the desert, far from being a safe journey, was full of challenges. But the survival instinct prevailed, and along with Sarai, Lot, and the servants, Abram set out for the land that seemed to offer a solution. The desert seemed endless as they crossed its vastness, but their hope was renewed with the prospect of finding relief along the fertile banks of the Nile. As they neared the borders of Egypt, Abram began to feel the weight of a new kind of fear. He knew that Sarai, his wife, was a woman of rare beauty, and he feared that in Egypt, a powerful pharaoh might covet her. The idea that her life might be at risk because of Sarai's beauty was not something he could easily ignore. Abram knew that, upon arriving in Egypt, the pharaoh might possibly want to take her for himself. And so, in an act of desperation, Abram had an idea. He would ask Sarai to pretend to be his sister, not his wife. He feared that if he was identified as Sarai's husband, the pharaoh would order his death in order to take her as his wife. But if Sarai were seen only as a sister, she might be protected, and Abram would be safe. This decision, made out of fear, was an attempt to protect his wife's life, but it was also a sign of the growing anxiety and lack of trust beginning to take root within him, even as he still trusted in God's promises. With a heavy heart and a tormented conscience over this choice, Abram and Sarai entered Egypt, aware that their future was once again uncertain. When Abram and Sarai arrived in Egypt, they were immediately welcomed by a vibrant land, full of life and opulence. The Nile flowed strongly, irrigating the fields and feeding the cities. Egypt seemed to be the refuge they so desperately needed. But as they entered the gates of the city, the fear Abram had carried in his chest grew. He knew that in Egypt, Sarai's beauty would not go unnoticed. Abram felt a chill as he imagined the pharaoh's eyes on his wife. He saw the gleam of admiration in the eyes of everyone who looked at her, from the simple inhabitants of the city to the pharaoh's officials, who would undoubtedly notice her. The pressure of his decision on her was clear in his gaze. Sarai, for her part, felt the tension that took hold of her husband, but despite this, she agreed with the plan he had suggested. They needed to survive, and this seemed to be the only viable path. In the days that followed, Sarai's beauty was indeed noticed. The pharaoh's officials were the first to report her presence to the court. When the pharaoh learned of her, he was impressed. His eyes locked on her as if nothing else mattered. He wasted no time in sending for her to be brought to the palace, intending to make her one of the women of his harem. Abram, watching all this with a mix of fear and relief, could do nothing but wait for the situation to unfold. He kept his distance from the pharaoh, fearing the worst, but at the same time convincing himself that the deception he had orchestrated would protect his life. He was safe, but what about Sarai? The pain and anguish of knowing his wife was now in the hands of another man were intense. However, he tried to convince himself that in the end, she would still be his wife. But God did not abandon Abram, not for a moment. Although Abram had given in to fear and deception, the Lord, faithful to his promise, did not allow the evil to be carried out. However, the Pharaoh was not spared the consequences of this situation. God, in his wisdom and mercy, sent a devastating plague upon Egypt. The land was struck, and diseases began to spread, affecting the Pharaoh and his court. This led the Pharaoh, bewildered and perplexed, to seek answers. Even though the sun had not yet fulfilled its promise to warm his land, Abram knew that faith would guide him to the end of the journey. His unwavering trust was the fuel that drove him forward. No matter how long it took or how difficult it became, God had spoken, and he would fulfill his word. As Abram and his family continued their journey through Canaan, a distant yet significant event was about to reshape the world they knew. Although they were isolated in their walk of faith, the impact of what had happened in other parts of the land was inescapable. Long before Abram, in a forgotten age, humanity had gathered in one place. The city of Babel, in the heart of Mesopotamia, stood with a tower that challenged the heavens themselves. The construction, immense and grand, was more than an architectural wonder. It was a declaration of pride and human attempts to reach the power and greatness of God. Its builders sought to make a name for themselves, so they would not be scattered across the earth. They desired to build a structure that connected to the heavens, a tower that defied divine order. But human arrogance never goes unnoticed. God, observing the efforts of Babel, knew that the unity of mankind could be used for evil if God's sovereignty was ignored. And so, he decided to intervene, breaking the common language that united all the peoples. Suddenly, the words that were once shared became incomprehensible. The people who had once worked together found themselves in conflict, unable to understand each other. The construction of the tower ceased, and the pride of man crumbled in a sea of confusion. God scattered the peoples across the earth, dividing them into nations with different languages. Those who had worked on the tower were forced to separate and go to new lands, and the great unity of mankind was broken. Babel, the city that aimed to reach the heavens, became a symbol of the failed attempt to challenge him. For Abram and his family, the echo of this event seemed distant, but the consequence was unfolding before them. The world, once united under a common language, was now a tapestry of cultures, peoples, and divided territories. But God's plan was in motion. As the world fragmented and nations emerged, the Lord looked upon Abram and chose that man, called Exalted Father, to restore the spiritual unity that had been lost in Babel's attempt. God had made a covenant with Abram, promising that he would become the father of a great nation, and through him, all nations would be blessed. The very fact that God chose Abram at this moment was no accident. It was a direct action to restore what human pride had fragmented. Abram did not fully understand the implications of this divine plan, but his faith was grounded in the certainty that, amid the scattering of peoples and the divisions of languages, he was chosen to bring hope to humanity. So, while the ruins of the Tower of Babel symbolized human failure, Abram saw before him the opportunity to be a beacon of faith and restoration for a broken world. Abram and his family finally arrived in the promised land, Canaan, but contrary to their expectations, the land was not prepared to welcome them with abundance. The fields were dry, and the pastures scarce. The relentless climate and lack of food became a constant concern. Abram knew that in times of difficulty, faith would be his greatest ally, but the physical needs were urgent and beginning to weigh on him and his family. The unyielding sun of the region made the journey more difficult with each passing day. Dust rose beneath the hooves of the animals and the tired feet of the family, and the food they had brought was running low. Water became harder and harder to find, and the days of scarcity threatened to undermine their confidence. He knew that God's promise to give him a great descent and the promised land still stood, but the current situation seemed desolate. After weeks of unsuccessful searching for a solution, Abram made a difficult but necessary decision. He decided to go down to Egypt, a prosperous country where food was abundant and fertile lands could ensure his family's survival. Egypt was known for its great wealth and the Nile, which brought life to its arid lands. Even though it was a distant land, full of strangers and dangers, it was the only viable option to keep his family from succumbing to hunger. The journey to Egypt was not simple. Crossing the desert, far from being a safe journey, was filled with challenges. But the instinct for survival prevailed, and along with Sarai, Lot, and the servants, Abram set off to the land that seemed to offer a solution. The desert seemed endless as they crossed its vastness, but their hope was renewed by the prospect of finding relief on the fertile banks of the Nile. As they neared the borders of Egypt, Abram began to feel the weight of a new kind of fear. He knew that Sarai, his wife, was a woman of rare beauty, and he feared that in Egypt, a powerful pharaoh might covet her. The idea that her life might be at risk because of Sarai's beauty was not something he could easily ignore. Abram knew that when they arrived in Egypt, the pharaoh might possibly want to take her for himself. And so, in a desperate act, Abram came up with an idea. He would ask Sarai to pretend to be his sister, not his wife. He feared that, if he were recognized as Sarai's husband, the pharaoh would order his death to take her as a wife. But if Sarai were seen only as a sister, she might be protected, and Abram would be safe. This decision, made out of fear, was an attempt to protect his wife's life, but it also signaled the growing anxiety and lack of trust that were beginning to grow within him, even as he still trusted in God's promises. With a heavy heart and a tortured conscience over this choice, Abram and Sarai entered Egypt, aware that their future, once again, was uncertain. When Abram and Sarai arrived in Egypt, they were immediately welcomed by a vibrant land full of life and opulence. The Nile flowed strongly, irrigating the fields and feeding the cities. Egypt seemed to be the refuge they so desperately needed. But as they entered the gates of the city, the fear that Abram carried in his chest grew. He knew that, in Egypt, Sarai's beauty would not go unnoticed. Abram shivered as he imagined the pharaoh's eyes upon his wife. He saw the admiration in the eyes of all who looked at her, from the simple inhabitants of the city to the pharaoh's officials, who would undoubtedly notice her. The pressure of his decision weighed heavily on her, visible in his gaze. Sarai, in turn, felt the tension that overtook her husband, but despite this, she agreed with the plan he suggested. They needed to survive, and this seemed the only viable path. In the days that followed, Sarai's beauty was indeed noticed. The pharaoh's officials were the first to report Sarai's presence to the court. When the pharaoh learned of her, he was impressed. His eyes fixed on her as though nothing else mattered. It didn't take long before he sent for her to bring her to the palace, intending to make her one of his wives. Abram, watching it all with a mix of fear and relief, could do nothing but wait for the situation to unfold. He kept his distance from the pharaoh, fearing the worst, but at the same time convincing himself that the deception he had devised would protect his life. He was safe, but what about Sarai? The pain and anguish of knowing his wife was now in another man's hands were intense. Yet, he tried to convince himself that, in the end, she would still be his wife. But God did not abandon Abram for a moment. Although Abram had given in to fear and deception, the Lord, faithful to his promise, did not allow evil to prevail. However, the Pharaoh was not spared the consequences of this situation. In his wisdom and mercy, God sent a devastating plague upon Egypt. The land was struck, and diseases began to spread, affecting the Pharaoh and his court. This caused the Pharaoh, confused and perplexed, to seek answers. After investigating, he soon discovered what had happened. Abram and Sarai were not siblings, as claimed, but husband and wife. The truth was revealed by God, who used the plagues as a clear sign that something was wrong. The Pharaoh, furious, summoned Abram to confront him. The Pharaoh, now aware of the deception, returned Sarai to her husband and, without further delay, ordered them to leave Egypt. "Why didn't you tell me she was your wife?" the Pharaoh asked angrily, his voice full of disappointment. "Now take your wife and go. I don't want you to do us any more harm." With their heads lowered and their hearts heavy, Abram and Sarai were expelled from Egypt, forced to leave the land that, for a brief moment, had seemed to offer security. As they crossed Egypt's borders, Abram reflected on the mistakes he had made. He had been faithful to God when he left Ur, but now in Egypt, his lack of faith and trust in God had almost cost his wife's life. Yet, in the midst of this tribulation, Abram also witnessed God's faithfulness, which delivered him even in the face of human failure. God had a purpose for him and Sarai, and he would guide them, even when they strayed from the right path. After their expulsion from Egypt, Abram and Sarai returned to the land of Canaan, but the difficulties were far from over. Although God's promise that Abram would be the father of a great nation still stood, the path to fulfilling that promise was far from easy. The land, though fertile, was vast and without many clear divisions, and as a result, tensions began to grow between Abram's herdsmen and the herdsmen of his nephew Lot. Lot, who had been traveling with his uncle since the beginning of the journey, had also prospered in Canaan. His flocks grew and his possessions increased, but as the land could not support both Abram's and Lot's growing wealth, a conflict arose. Abram, though wise and generous, understood the importance of peace. He knew that no matter how much land there was, their relationship was far more important than any material possession. And so, Abram and Lot decided to part ways, giving each other space to grow without conflict. Abram, the elder, allowed Lot to choose the land he preferred. Lot, seeing the fertile plains of the Jordan Valley, chose to settle in the area near Sodom and Gomorrah, known for its prosperity. Abram, meanwhile, took the more barren hills of Canaan. As Abram settled in the land of Canaan, God once again appeared to him and renewed his promise. Look to the north, south, east, and west. All the land you see will be given to you and your descendants forever. From that moment on, Abram had the assurance that God would continue to guide him. Though he had been tested by famine, deception, and the separation from his nephew, he knew that the promise of a great nation and a future blessing for all nations still held true. The trials Abram faced were not over, but God's covenant remained unbroken. And through these challenges, Abram's faith would only grow stronger. After the great victory over the 4 kings and the rescue of Lot, Abram, exhausted but victorious, returned to his camp in Canaan. The journey had been arduous, but the sense of duty fulfilled and divine protection gave him a new vigor. Upon his return, Abram was met with gratitude and joy by his family and servants. However, he was still far from completing his mission. The war, though won, had left him with many lessons and questions about the future, about the covenant God had made with him, and most importantly, about the true purpose of his life. It was then, when he least expected it, that he had an encounter that would change his view of what lay ahead. A mysterious man, of distinctive appearance and surrounded by a heavenly glow, appeared before him. It was Melchizedek, the king of Salem, a city further to the north, which until that moment was little known. Melchizedek, surprisingly, was also a priest of the Most High God, not just a secular monarch. This title, uncommon at the time, already stirred in Abram a sense of reverence and curiosity. Melchizedek was not just a ruler. He had a unique and unparalleled spiritual authority. When they met, Melchizedek blessed Abram, saying, "Blessed be Abram by the Most High God, creator of heaven and earth." These words echoed in Abram's heart, and at that moment, he felt the weight of God's blessing upon him in a profound way. In response, Abram, in a gesture of humility and recognition, offered Melchizedek a tithe of everything he had won in battle, 10% of the spoils of war, as a symbol of gratitude and submission to God. This act was not just a gesture of generosity, but also a recognition of Melchizedek's spiritual authority. Abram knew he was before someone much more than a mere king, someone who seemed to be a figure sent by God to convey a message of peace, blessing, and divine connection. The priest of Salem, in turn, also offered Abram bread and wine as a sign of communion and covenant. It was a simple offering, but laden with spiritual significance, a reminder that God had always desired for his people to be nourished and sustained, both physically and spiritually. Melchizedek, without seeking recognition or power over Abram, blessed him again, and with this, the message became clear. Abram's true victory was not in his military conquests, but in the covenant he had with God and his ability to recognize the spiritual authority of other sent ones of God. The encounter with Melchizedek was significant not only for Abram, but for the entire history of faith. He became a symbol of Jesus Christ, the eternal priest, who would also come to bring salvation and reconciliation between God and humanity. Melchizedek, in a mysterious and prophetic way, represented the role of Christ, being a priest without known genealogy, a king of peace and justice, who sought not his own glory but the glory of the Most High God. With this, Abram returned to his journey with a renewed spirit. The victory had not only been over enemy kings, but also over his own inner struggle and the doubts that had plagued him. He now understood more clearly the purpose of his mission. He was God's chosen one to be the father of a great nation, a people that would be a light to all the nations of the earth. The morning breeze gently blew over the hills of Canaan as Abram, deep in thought, walked alone, away from his camp. The war was now behind him, but a deep emptiness seemed to fill his heart. He had defeated powerful enemies, rescued his nephew, and received the blessing of Melchizedek, But a lingering doubt persisted, an unanswered question that consumed him. He was already old, and Sarai, his wife, was too. They had no children. The promise of God to make Abram the father of a great nation seemed more and more distant. How could a great descendant arise from a man without children? How could he be the father of so many nations when his house was empty of heirs? With the weight of doubt upon his shoulders, Abram looked up at the night sky, at the stars shining in the vast firmament. "Lord," he said in prayer, "what good is all the wealth and honor that you have promised me if I have no heir to leave it to? What will become of me when I depart, if there is no son to follow in my footsteps?" Suddenly, a soft yet powerful voice resonated in Abram's heart. It was the voice of God himself, calling him out of his tent. "Look to the heavens," said the Lord. "Count the stars if you are able. So shall your descendants be." Abram lifted his eyes to the sky, and the stars seemed to multiply before his eyes, infinite, beyond human comprehension. God's promise was now not just of an heir, but of an immeasurable lineage, greater than anything he could imagine. His heart ignited with a new hope, and he felt strengthened, as if the stars themselves were witnessing the covenant between him and the Lord. God continued, "I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land as an inheritance." Abram, speechless, felt a deep peace settle in his heart. The promise that had seemed so distant now became tangible before his eyes. God had not only called him to be the father of a great nation, but would also grant him the land that would be the home of this people. But in a moment of doubt that still plagued him, Abram asked, "Lord, how will I know that I will possess this land?" It was then that God instructed Abram to prepare a ritual. He was to bring a heifer, a goat, and a lamb, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a pigeon. Abram did as God commanded, and when night fell, he separated the animals, cutting them in half and placing the halves opposite one another, creating a path between them. The act seemed strange and filled with mystery, but Abram knew it was a sign, a covenant that God was establishing with him. The silence of the night was broken when Abram, tired, fell into a deep sleep. It was in this dreamlike state that God revealed to him something even deeper and more unsettling. A vision of a distant future where his descendants would be enslaved in a foreign land for 400 years, but in the end, they would return to the promised land. God revealed that this journey would be long, but he would be with his people every step of the way. The vision passed, and Abram woke with a start. The covenant was sealed, and the stars in the sky seemed to shine even more brightly, as if celebrating what had just been sealed between him and God. The promise was now clear and irrevocable. A great nation would arise from his lineage, and he would be the father of a descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. As he looked at the stars one last time, Abram felt a peace that transcended his doubts. He trusted in God and knew that with him, nothing was impossible. The covenant had been made, and the journey of faith continued. The next morning dawned clear and silent, but the air was charged with a divine weight. Abram was still immersed in thoughts about the vision he had had during the night, the promise of a vast descendant, and the certainty that the covenant between him and God was stronger than ever. However, the Lord was not finished with him. God called Abram to an act of faith that would seal the covenant in a solemn and irrevocable way. He instructed Abram to prepare a sacred ritual, a covenant sealed in blood, which would serve as an eternal reminder of his promise. God asked Abram to take a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old goat, a 3-year-old lamb, a dove, and a pigeon. Abram, obedient, brought the animals to the designated place and sacrificed them as God had instructed, dividing them in half and placing the halves opposite one another, creating a path between them. The ritual of cutting the animals in half was an ancient practice, a way to symbolize the deep and unbreakable commitment between the parties of a covenant. It was an alliance that said, "If I fail, may the same happen to me." It was a covenant so sacred that, once sealed, the parties involved committed to fulfilling what had been agreed upon, under the penalty of great consequences. The sky was growing dark as the day came to an end, and Abraham, tired, watched the pieces of the animals before him. The silence was profound, only interrupted by the sounds of nature around him. But as he sat there, waiting for a divine response, something mysterious happened. A sense of fear and great reverence began to fill his heart. He saw a thick darkness, like a terrifying darkness that covered the earth, and in the middle of it, a flame, like a sacrificial fire, descended upon the animals. Abraham watched, paralyzed, as the fire approached, moving in a supernatural way. He knew this moment was decisive. The fire represented God's presence, holiness, and the living presence of his promise. The flame passed between the pieces of the sacrificed animals, sealing the covenant in a supernatural way. The Lord spoke again to Abraham, saying, "This is the sign that the land you see will be given to your descendants. Although they will suffer in a foreign land, one day they will return, and that land will be theirs." God's words were full of power and authority, and Abraham felt the certainty that his faith was being rewarded. God's act of sealing the covenant in such a visible and powerful way was confirmation that he would keep his promises, no matter the challenges ahead. Abraham, seeing the flame of God pass by, knew that he would be with his descendants through all difficulties, caring for them and fulfilling his word. As the vision dissipated and the sun began to rise, Abraham stood there alone, but with his spirit renewed. The covenant was firmly established, and the promise that once seemed a distant dream now became a solid reality, etched in history. God does not fail in his promises. Abraham's journey was just beginning, but he knew that, even in moments of uncertainty, the covenant with the Creator would be his strength. He was not just following a path of faith, he was walking beside a God who never fails. God's promise to Abraham still seemed distant, and the years were passing without him and Sarai having children. The pain of infertility weighed heavily on their hearts, especially on Sarai. In her great faith and also in her despair, she began to question how God's promises could come to pass if time kept passing, and she couldn't give Abraham the promised son. It was then that Sarai had an idea, a plan that, though impulsive, seemed to be a solution to her distress. She suggested to Abraham that he take her servant Hagar as his wife so that she could have a child by her, who would be considered the heir. It was a common practice in some cultures of the time, but still, this idea came with its complications. Abraham, though hesitant, consented. He trusted Sarai, and in his heart, the desire to fulfill God's promise still burned intensely. Hagar, the Egyptian servant, became pregnant, and soon her belly became evident. However, what seemed like a quick solution to the lack of an heir soon turned into a source of conflict. When Sarai saw that Hagar was pregnant, she felt a great weight on her chest, a mix of jealousy and frustration. Hagar's presence, now carrying the child she herself had been unable to conceive, brought tensions into her home. The rivalry between the two women grew, and Sarai, unable to cope with the situation, treated Hagar cruelly, causing her to flee from her presence. Hagar, alone and distressed, fled into the desert. It was there, by a well, where she sat, full of hopelessness, that God appeared to her in a vision. The Lord called her by name and asked where she had come from and where she was going. Hagar, with a choked voice, explained that she had fled from Sarai, her mistress. God, with compassion, responded that she should return and submit to Sarai, but promised that she would not be alone. God announced that her son would be a great man, and that he would be called Ishmael, which means God hears, for God had heard Hagar's suffering. She would receive the strength to return and fulfill what she had been commanded. Hagar, with her heart relieved by the divine promise, returned to Abraham and Sarai's camp. When Ishmael was born, Abraham and Sarai, despite the difficulties, received the child with a mix of acceptance and hope. Although Ishmael was not the son of God's promise to Abraham, he would be a blessing in his own line of descendants. The birth of Ishmael, however, was not the end of Abraham's story of faith. God still had more plans, and Abraham's dream of seeing his descendants like the stars in the sky continued to unfold in mysterious ways. As Ishmael grew, God's promise to Abraham was still waiting for the perfect moment to be fulfilled. And so, the story of Abraham, Sarai, Hagar, and Ishmael moved forward, marked by faith, human failures, and God's constant intervention, which never ceased to guide those who trusted in his words. Hagar had given birth to Ishmael, and though he was a gift from God, he was not the promised son. Abraham, in his heart, still hoped that God's promise would be fully realized. The Lord, seeing Abraham's faith and his deep desire to fulfill his will, made a new chapter of the covenant to be established. In a moment of deep revelation, God appeared to Abraham and said to him, "I am Almighty God, walk before me and be blameless. I will establish my covenant between me and you, and I will make you a great nation." But God not only reaffirmed his promise, he revealed a new sign that would mark the covenant between him and Abraham's descendants for all generations. The covenant would no longer just be a verbal promise. It would be physically sealed, as a symbol of Abraham's and his descendants' dedication to God. God commanded Abraham that circumcision would be the eternal sign of the covenant. Every man in Abraham's household, including Ishmael, would be circumcised as a pact of commitment and separation from the other nations. Circumcision would become the visible symbol of the special relationship between God and Abraham's people. It was a serious and transformative moment. Abraham, with his deep faith and obedience, heard God's command and did what was asked without hesitation. He knew that this mark, though physical, represented something much greater: the dedication of his heart to God and his belief in God's promises. God also revealed that Sarai, now with her new name, Sarah, would be the mother of the promised son, who would come as the confirmation of the divine covenant. Despite her advanced age, Sarah would have a son, and his name would be Isaac, which means laughter, for joy would abound when it happened. God assured Abraham that Isaac would be the heir of the promise, and that the covenant would be established with him and his descendants, not with Ishmael. Abraham's obedience to the sign of circumcision was more than a physical act. It was the mark of a deep inner commitment. Abraham and all the members of his household, including his son Ishmael and all the servants, were physically marked by the covenant with God. Circumcision became the symbol of God's promise to bless Abraham's descendants, a lineage that would bring a chosen nation to bless all the nations of the earth. With this covenant established, Abraham felt closer to God than ever. He knew his journey would not be easy, but with the sign of circumcision, he was reaffirming his commitment to the Creator, who had called him to be the father of a nation that would carry true worship and faithfulness to God to the world. Circumcision, more than a simple ritual, became the heart of the covenant with God, a covenant that would transcend generations and one day be fulfilled in an even more glorious way with the birth of Isaac, the promised son. It was a warm afternoon in the land of Canaan. Abraham, now of advanced age, was sitting at the door of his tent when suddenly he saw 3 men approaching. They were not ordinary travelers. There was something different about their presence, something that radiated an aura of mystery and power. Abraham, with his generous heart, immediately stood up to welcome them. He ran to them, offering them water and inviting them to sit in the shade so they could rest from their journey. Abraham, with a gesture of humility and reverence, made sure to prepare a special meal for the visitors. He asked his nephew Lot to prepare fresh bread and instructed his servant to prepare a lamb to serve to the mysterious guests. When the meal was served, the 3 men ate under Abraham's tent. But it was what was to come that would make this meeting unforgettable. During the banquet, one of the men spoke directly to Abraham, revealing himself not just as a simple traveler, but as the Lord himself, the Almighty God. He made a marvelous promise. Within a year, Sarah, your wife, will have a son. Abraham's heart filled with disbelief, and as he looked at his wife, who was already advanced in age, he was amazed by the boldness of such a promise. However, there was something even more extraordinary. God himself was speaking to him. Sarah, who had been listening from behind the tent, quietly laughed in disbelief. How could a woman so old bear a child? She had already given up on having children, but in the face of this divine word, doubt and disbelief took hold of her. She couldn't help but laugh, but God, who knows the hearts of all, immediately spoke to Abraham, saying, "Why did Sarah laugh? Does she not believe she can give birth? But nothing is impossible for God." Sarah, stunned and embarrassed by her laughter, tried to deny that she had laughed, but God reassured her that what he had promised he would fulfill. Within a year, the impossible would happen, and Sarah would give birth to the promised child, Isaac. This extraordinary moment was not just an announcement of a birth, but a powerful lesson for Abraham and Sarah. Though time and human circumstances seemed against them, the Lord, in his sovereignty, was able to accomplish what seemed humanly impossible. This visit, more than just a promise of a child, was a reminder that God can turn doubt into hope, impossibility into reality, and disbelief into faith. And so, when the 3 visitors prepared to leave, Abraham accompanied them for a short distance. Before parting ways, the visitors revealed that they were heading to the city of Sodom, where wickedness had reached intolerable levels. God was going to judge the city, but before acting, he revealed his plans to Abraham, allowing him to intercede. Abraham, with a heart full of compassion, interceded for any righteous person still in Sodom, knowing that the city was full of iniquity. The visit of the 3 angels was not only an announcement of a miracle for Abraham and Sarah, but also an opportunity for Abraham to grow even more in his faith and trust in God, understanding that God reveals his plans to those who trust in him, and that he always acts with justice and mercy. The scorching heat of the day seemed to intensify the tension in the air. The three visitors had left Abraham's house and continued their journey toward Sodom. Abraham, with a heavy heart, became thoughtful. He knew the immorality and depravity that plagued the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, but he also knew that, amidst all that evil, there might still be a thread of hope. Perhaps there were still righteous people in those cities. He could not stop praying for them, so with firm faith, he interceded, trusting in God's just nature. Following the visitors, Abraham was challenged to face the inevitable judgment that God had determined. The angels revealed to Abraham that indeed the cry of injustice that had risen to heaven had become unbearable. God, in his justice, had decided to destroy the two cities. However, before taking action, God allowed Abraham to intercede, knowing that he was a man of faith and compassion. Abraham courageously approached and with humility dared to ask, "If there are 50 righteous people in Sodom, will you destroy the city? For the sake of 50 righteous people, will you spare it?" God, with his patience and kindness, answered affirmatively. Abraham, feeling the responsibility to intercede further, began to lower the number, asking, "And if there are 45, and 40, and 30, and 20? God, always willing to listen and show mercy, agreed to spare the city if there were the number of righteous people Abraham mentioned. Finally, Abraham asked, "And if there are 10 righteous people?" God, in his infinite mercy, answered, "For the sake of 10 righteous people, I will not destroy the city." And so, with a heart full of compassion and hope, Abraham watched the visitors continue on their way. However, he knew that the situation was even more dire than he had imagined. The angels arrived at the city of Sodom, and as night fell, they found Lot, Abraham's nephew, sitting at the city gate. Lot, knowing the ruthless character of the inhabitants of Sodom, offered the hospitality of his home to the visitors, trying to protect them. But the depraved city did not hesitate. The men of Sodom surrounded Lot's house, demanding that the visitors be handed over to satisfy their perverse desires. Lot, in a desperate act of protection, offered his own daughters in place of the visitors, but the city's inhabitants were blinded by evil and insatiable lust. At this moment, the angels intervened, blinding the men of the city so that they could no longer attack, and told Lot that he should leave the city immediately, for God's judgment was about to be executed. They warned Lot, his wife, and daughters to flee without looking back. The destruction would be swift and relentless. Lot, his wife, and daughters made their way toward the mountains, fleeing from the inferno that was drawing near. But Lot's wife, with a look of longing and perhaps even regret, looked back, disobeying God's instruction. Immediately, she was turned into a pillar of salt. Fire and sulfur rained down from heaven, consuming Sodom and Gomorrah in an explosion of divine destruction. The cities were completely destroyed, their wealth, their lives, and their corruptions became an eternal symbol of God's unyielding justice against sin. Nothing remained but devastation, a reminder that evil cannot prosper before God. Lot and his daughters reached the mountains, and the judgment on the wicked cities was complete. God's promise had been fulfilled. He had heard Abraham's prayer, but also executed his justice, showing the world the seriousness of sin and the need to live in righteousness. The story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah endures as an eternal warning, reminding us that although God is full of mercy, he is also just and does not tolerate unrestrained wickedness. Sin has consequences, and God's mercy, though abundant, should never be taken for granted. After the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot and his daughters had taken refuge in the mountains, trying to escape the devastation that consumed the cities. Fear still filled their hearts. The sound of the flames still echoed in their memories, and Lot's wife, turned into a pillar of salt, was a painful reminder of what they had lost. But now, more than ever, Lot knew he could not live isolated in the mountains. He and his daughters needed a future, a chance to begin anew. As the sun rose, shining softly on the hills, Lot's thoughts turned to the future of his lineage. He knew his daughters needed a future, and being the last man of his household, he felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. The fear of loneliness began to spread in his heart. It was impossible, at that moment, to imagine that all that remained of his family could be wiped out in an instant. The angels, who had guided Lot and his family to safety, had completed their mission of saving the righteous, but there was still a role to be played. They now had to fulfill Abraham's request, who had interceded for his nephew with such love and compassion. Lot was a righteous man, but circumstances had become complicated in an unimaginable way. Suddenly, an unexpected visit found them in the mountains. When Lot was in his dwelling, there in the lonely lands, two angels appeared again. Seeing their visit, Lot's heart stirred with a mixture of fear and hope. They had come for a reason, a call for rescue, but this time, it was Lot who needed to be rescued. "Get up and flee south," said the angels. "The destruction is not over. You and your daughters must protect yourselves now. The city of Zoar is safe. Go there and stay." Lot hesitated. He knew time was running out, but a part of him wanted to escape the desolation of the mountains and find a new life. He asked the angels if he could find refuge in a nearby city. The angels, in their patience and mercy, agreed and directed Lot to the city of Zoar. But the sun was already setting on the horizon, and the moment of final destruction was drawing near. Lot, his daughters, and his servants, hastily departing, crossed the mountains and made their way to the city of Zoar, leaving behind the devastation and pain. During the journey, the terror of the imminent destruction and the howling of the wind, like a warning that God's wrath was about to be fulfilled, made each step heavier. The city of Zoar now stood as the last possible refuge where they could, at last, find some peace. But as they reached Zoar, Lot's regret and fear began to weigh heavily on his shoulders. He knew that the story of his home and the disaster of Sodom would be etched forever in their hearts. Still, he listened to what the angels said. "Stay safe, for you are under God's protection." Lot, with his daughters and servants, found shelter in Zoar and for the first time took a brief respite in his long journey. The complete destruction of the city of Sodom continued to echo in the mountains, a reminder that the wickedness of Sodom and Gomorrah would not go unrecognized. The judgment had been relentless, but salvation was also evident. As Lot watched the flames consuming the last spark of life in Sodom, he reflected on the difficult moments he had faced, Abraham's compassion, and above all, God's mercy, which had granted him a second chance. Lot's rescue marked the end of the condemnation of the cities, but also the beginning of a new journey of rebuilding for him and his daughters, far from the corruption and destruction of a world that now seemed too distant to remember. The desert winds blew gently over Abraham's camp, but inside his tent, the silence was thick, heavy with expectation. Abraham and Sarai, now advanced in age, still had no children. God's promise that Abraham would be the father of a great nation seemed, in moments of doubt, like a distant and almost impossible reality. The years passed, and hope seemed to fade slowly. Sarai, burdened by infertility, felt frustrated and at times desperate. She knew time was running out, and God's promise had still not been fulfilled. But as so many times before, God had a plan that surpassed what they could understand. One afternoon, while Abraham was meditating on the promises made to him, an unexpected visitor appeared at the door of his tent. It was three men, but one of them stood out by his presence. With authority and calm, he approached Abraham and said, "Next year, Sarai will give birth to a son." The words resonated in Abraham's heart like distant thunder. Sarai, who was behind the tent, heard the words and, astonished, could not help but let out a soft laugh, incredulous. She was so old. How could she give birth to a son? She laughed with the disbelief of someone who had heard something impossible. The visitor, who was the Lord himself, looked at her and said, "Why did you laugh, Sarai? Is anything too impossible for God?" Sarai's laughter was replaced by a heavy silence. She, fearful, denied her disbelief, but God reaffirmed his promise. "No, you will have a son." That moment was like a cool breeze that blew over Sarai's heart, restoring the hope she had long lost. But the weight of the impossible still lingered in her mind. However, it didn't take long for the impossible to become a reality. And as God had promised, 9 months later, Sarai gave birth to a son. The laughter that once came from doubt now transformed into joy and celebration. Abraham and Sarai named the boy Isaac, which meant laughter. The name was not only a reminder of the initial disbelief, but also of the great joy that filled their hearts when they finally saw God's promise come to life before their eyes. Isaac's birth was not just the fulfillment of a personal promise, but the beginning of a new chapter in the history of humanity. He would be the son of the promise, the heir to the covenant God made with Abraham. Isaac, small and fragile in the early days of his life, carried in his future the destiny of a nation chosen by God. Abraham and Sarai looked at Isaac with the eyes of those who had seen the impossible become possible, the supernatural manifest in their lives. They knew that what had begun with a promise made in the desert, many years before, was now coming to fruition before their eyes. God, once again, had proven his faithfulness, and Isaac was the visible sign of his greatness. As the baby slept peacefully in their arms, Abraham knew that the journey was just beginning, and what God had started, he would certainly finish. Sarai's laughter was no longer one of disbelief, but of gratitude, for in her womb, she carried not only the inheritance of a people, but the promise that would give rise to God's people. The days of peace at Abraham's camp were about to be challenged by a growing tension, fueled by the past and spreading like fire. Isaac, the son of the promise, was now growing before his parents' eyes, and Abraham's love for him was immeasurable. Isaac represented hope, the fulfillment of a covenant made with God, and he carried with him the future of the promised nation. However, while Isaac flourished under the care of Abraham and Sarai, Ishmael, Abraham's son by Hagar, his Egyptian servant, was already older. He had been Abraham's first son, but not the chosen one to be the heir of the promise. Ishmael, though loved by his father, always knew his position was different, and that difference became more apparent as Isaac grew. The relationship between the two boys, once relatively peaceful, began to deteriorate. Ishmael, with his impulsive nature and the shadow of jealousy growing in his heart, began to mock Isaac. This did not go unnoticed by Sarai, who, with her maternal sensitivity, saw Ishmael's behavior as a sign that he did not accept his younger brother as the heir to the promise. Ishmael's jealousy was not just a matter of sibling rivalry, but reflected a deeper struggle, rooted in history and in God's promises. While Isaac represented the fulfillment of God's covenant, Ishmael represented the human attempt to forge a path of his own for the fulfillment of a promise. Sarai, deeply distressed by the situation, went to Abraham and asked him to send away Hagar and Ishmael. "I cannot allow this son of a slave to live with my son of the promise," she said, with the pain of a mother who sees her family threatened. Abraham, though saddened by the situation, knew that Sarai's request was aligned with God's will. God confirmed to him that Ishmael would also be blessed, but he would not be the heir to the covenant. "Listen to your wife, for Isaac is the son of the promise," God said, assuring Abraham that he would take care of Ishmael. With a heavy heart, Abraham sent Hagar and Ishmael into the desert, giving them provisions and his blessing. When the woman and the boy left, a difficult chapter in Abraham's life came to an end. Hagar wandered through the desert with Ishmael, on the brink of death from thirst and despair. But God did not abandon them. In a moment of anguish, God appeared to Hagar, showing her a well of water, and assured her that Ishmael too would become the father of a great nation. Ishmael grew in the desert, becoming a skilled man with the bow and the father of a powerful lineage, as God had promised. Although he and Isaac went separate ways, God's blessing on Ishmael never failed. For Abraham, the episode was a reminder that, despite conflicts and difficulties, God's faithfulness did not depend on human actions, but on his eternal promise. Abraham did not fully understand how things would unfold, but he knew that both Isaac and Ishmael were part of God's plan for the future of humanity. Thus, the conflict between the two brothers marked a turning point in history, signaling that God's covenant with Abraham would extend to many nations, with all the complexities and challenges that would arise over time. Time had passed, and Abraham was already an elderly man, with a beard as white as snow and a piercing gaze that reflected all the wisdom of a life devoted to faith. What he could never imagine, however, was that the greatest test of his faith was about to happen, a trial that would challenge even the firmest trust in God. God, who had already made so many promises to Abraham, now called him to an unprecedented challenge. "Abraham," said a serene and deep voice, echoing in the corners of his soul, "take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. There, offer him as a sacrifice on a mountain I will show you." Abraham froze for a moment. What he heard seemed like a dream, an idea impossible to carry out. Isaac, his only son, the son of promise, the one God had given him when all hope seemed lost, would now be taken from him? Abraham felt the weight of sorrow in his heart, but his faith did not waver. He knew that if God had called him, he would also make a way. The next morning, without hesitation, Abraham woke early and prepared everything necessary for the journey. He took the donkey, chopped wood, and prepared the fire. Isaac, still young and innocent, accompanied his father on the trip, unaware of what awaited him. Along the way, the tension hung in the air. Abraham, with a distant look and a troubled spirit, said nothing to Isaac about the sacrifice. They walked for 3 long days, and with each step, Abraham felt the weight of the decision he had made. The silence between father and son was deep, as if the universe itself was waiting for a revelation. Finally, upon reaching Mount Moriah, Abraham instructed the servants to stay behind. He and Isaac climbed together to the top of the mountain. Isaac, already sensing that something was wrong, looked at his father and asked with a trembling voice, "Father, we have the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the sacrifice?" Abraham, with a heavy heart, answered with unwavering faith, "God will provide the lamb for the sacrifice, my son." But deep inside, he knew the lamb was Isaac. He trusted that, if necessary, God could even raise his son from the dead, for he would always fulfill his promises. When they reached the altar that Abraham had built, the old patriarch bound Isaac, who now understood the gravity of the situation. With a firm hand, Abraham took the knife, his heart heavy, but his trust in God still strong as a rock. He was ready to obey, even if it meant losing everything he loved. But just as the blade was about to descend, a powerful voice interrupted the silence. "Abraham, Abraham!" It was the voice of God, urgently calling his name. Abraham, with bated breath, stopped in his tracks and looked up to the heavens. "Do not harm the boy," God commanded. "Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld your only son from me." And looking to the side, Abraham saw a ram caught by its horns in a bush. God had provided the sacrifice. With tears in his eyes, Abraham offered the ram in place of Isaac, giving thanks to the Lord for his mercy and faithfulness. Isaac, freed from the altar, felt an indescribable relief, and the two embraced with renewed love, knowing that their journey had been marked by an eternal lesson. Obedience to God is more valuable than any sacrifice. In his infinite grace, God reaffirmed his promise to Abraham. "Because you have done this and have not withheld your son from me, I will bless you abundantly, and your descendants will be as numerous as the stars of the sky and the sand on the seashore." Abraham's test was not only a trial of faith, but a foreshadowing of the greatest sacrifice in history. The sacrifice of Christ, God's only Son, given for the love of humanity. Abraham's heart was pierced, but his faith was strengthened, knowing that, even in the hardest trials, God always provided a way. The sky was clear, and the gentle wind blew over the land of Canaan when God appeared again to Abraham, his faithful servant. After the extreme test he had faced, God's promise seemed even more precious, like a diamond shining in the light of eternity. Abraham, now more mature and with a heart full of gratitude, knelt before God, revering him with all his soul. It was then that the Lord, with a gentle yet authoritative voice, spoke once more. "Abraham, do not fear, for I am your shield, and your reward will be very great." Abraham's heart raced with emotion as he heard the words of his Lord. The promise he had awaited for so long was now becoming even more solid and unshakable, a divine covenant that would transcend all generations. God continued, "I am the one who will make your descendants grow like the stars of the sky, like the sand by the seashore. Through you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed." Abraham, though he had heard these words before, felt an even greater weight in them. It was not just a promise of children and prosperity, but a promise that would affect all of humanity. With renewed faith, Abraham understood that this covenant did not depend on his perfection, but on the faithfulness of God, who is unchanging. The difficulties, the trials, and the challenges of life might try to divert his gaze, but God's word was firm, and his future was in the hands of the one who would never fail. And in that moment, God once again assured Abraham that his covenant was sealed forever, and that through him, a great nation would arise, marked by justice, peace, and faithfulness. He said to him, "Look to the heavens, count the stars, if you can count them. So will your descendants be." The vision before Abraham was almost insurmountable, as if he were looking into the distant future, to all the generations that would be touched by his obedience. To human eyes, it might have been hard to understand how such an elderly man, with his wife also advanced in age, could be the beginning of something so grand. But God's promise was not limited to what the eyes could see. Abraham was beginning to see, with growing clarity, that the covenant made was not just about a physical descendants, but a spiritual lineage that would transcend generations, reaching even the ends of the earth. Isaac, the son of promise, the symbol of absolute trust in God, would be the beginning of a line that would lead to the great nation. But more importantly, it would be the lineage that, through his descendants, would bring forth a universal blessing, a savior who would redeem all of humanity. At that moment of renewed promise, Abraham felt the peace of God surround him, as if a celestial light enveloped him and dissipated all doubt. He knew that the future was not in his hands, but in the hands of the one who is faithful to fulfill what he promises. Abraham's path would not be easy, but he was ready to follow it, for now he was certain that the God who had called him to be the father of a great nation would never forsake him. As he rose, Abraham looked at the vast land before him, the future of his descendants vast and promising. He knew that God's promises were irrevocable, and that through his obedience, a new chapter for humanity was about to begin. The dawn was breaking on the horizon, and the sun began to illuminate the hills of Moriah. Abraham stood, his gaze fixed in the distance, still immersed in the depth of the command God had given him. It was a test he had never imagined. The sacrifice of his own son, Isaac, the son of promise, the heir to the great nation that God had promised. The silence that surrounded Abraham was thick. He knew that God's word was clear and unquestionable, but the weight of what he was about to do consumed him. Isaac, still young and inexperienced, looked at his father, unaware of what was to come. Abraham felt his heart tight, a pain that went beyond the physical, a spiritual pain that cut through his soul. But in his mind and heart, one conviction reigned. God's faithfulness would never fail, and his obedience would be the key to fulfilling the divine purpose. Throughout the journey, Abraham tried to focus on God's voice, but his spirit was consumed by an internal conflict. "How can I do this?" he questioned, yet at the same time, he knew that true faith wasn't about fully understanding, but about trusting, even in the most incomprehensible situations. He knew that somehow God would provide. When they reached the top of the mountain, Abraham prepared the altar, his hands trembling yet determined. He made the fire and placed the wood, his heart growing heavier with each passing moment. Isaac, innocent and trusting in his father, asked, "Where is the lamb for the sacrifice, Father?" The question echoed deep within Abraham's soul. How could he answer that? How could he explain to his son that he himself was the offering? But with unwavering faith, Abraham looked at Isaac and replied, "God will provide the lamb, my son." Those words were not just an expression of hope, but a profound revelation of Abraham's trust in God's character. He knew that, even in the face of a request that seemed cruel and incomprehensible, God was working on something greater, something that transcended the present moment. With the altar prepared, Abraham looked up to the sky, praying silently. Then, with a gesture that seemed to be the most painful of his life, he raised the knife, ready to obey. But before the blade could descend, an angel of God appeared, halting the sacrifice. "Abraham, Abraham!" The angel's voice echoed through the air, and fear and relief took hold of his body. The Lord, in his infinite mercy, did not require the sacrifice of Isaac, but wanted to see how far Abraham's faith would go. "Now I know that you fear God," said the angel. Abraham looked to the side, and there, in a bush, he saw a ram caught by its horns. The sacrifice had been provided. With tears in his eyes, Abraham knelt before God, thanking him for his provision. This moment of faith and obedience would become a deep spiritual symbol for all of humanity. The sacrifice of Isaac, though not carried out, was a precursor to the greater sacrifice that was to come, the sacrifice of God's Son, Jesus Christ, who would be given for the salvation of the world. Abraham's faith, his willingness to give up what he loved most, foreshadowed the supreme sacrifice of God the Father in his own Son. What Abraham could not fully understand at that moment was that his act of faith would become a reference for all of history. The concept of obeying without understanding, trusting even in trials, was engraved in the hearts of God's people as a model of genuine faith. Abraham, the father of faith, demonstrated that, in the end, true faith is the kind that submits fully to God's will, without reservation, without questioning. By providing the ram, God revealed his mercy but also taught a profound lesson. Obedience is the path to true trust in his goodness and faithfulness. Therefore, the sacrifice of Isaac was not just a test for Abraham, but an eternal lesson for all those who wish to follow God with unwavering faith. And so, Abraham and Isaac descended the mountain, hearts filled with gratitude and reverence. Abraham knew more than ever that God was faithful and that in all things he would provide. Through this experience, he became the model of faith and obedience for all the generations to come. The wind gently blew across the hills of Canaan as Abraham gazed at the horizon, his eyes fixed on God's promise. That land, which had been given to him, now seemed to expand before his eyes. But the greatness of God's promise wasn't something he saw with his human eyes. He didn't see the vast descendants God had promised, nor the great nation that would arise from his lineage. The truth was that he didn't yet possess what had been promised, but the faith he carried kept him steadfast. Father of Faith. This title given to him was not by chance. Abraham was not called this because he had an easy life, or because he saw God's promise fulfilled instantly. He was called the Father of Faith because his journey was marked by challenges, doubts, and trials, but also by an unshakable commitment to God's word. Abraham experienced moments of uncertainty, just like all of us. He had moments when his faith wavered. When God's promise of numerous descendants seemed impossible, when he and Sarai were aging, and pregnancy seemed a distant dream, Abraham had to hold on to something bigger than himself. There was no physical evidence that God would fulfill his promise, but Abraham didn't look at the circumstances. He looked to God. His faith wasn't a passive faith, waiting for something to happen without any action. Abraham's faith led him to make bold decisions, to leave his homeland, to build altars, and to seek God's face. He rose up and acted according to the word given to him. This was the true essence of faith, trust and action. Abraham's faith was also rooted in a deep and personal relationship with God. Abraham didn't see God as a distant force, but as a friend and ally. He conversed with God, asked questions, sought guidance, but at the same time, submitted to his will. This kind of relationship is what God desired. A faith built not only on promises, but on an ongoing, personal relationship. In many of his decisions, Abraham followed paths unknown to him, without knowing exactly what he would encounter ahead. He was called to leave his home, his family, his city, and go to a land he didn't know. He had to learn to trust, not knowing what would come next. And that was what God wanted to teach him. Trust, even without seeing the immediate answer. Be faithful, even when the future seemed uncertain. When Abraham prepared to sacrifice Isaac, his faith was tested in the ultimate way. He didn't understand God's purpose, but he knew that trusting in God didn't depend on fully understanding his actions. He trusted God because he knew who God was. He knew God was faithful, even in the toughest circumstances. This was Abraham's greatest legacy: unwavering faith, unbreakable trust in God. He teaches us that true faith isn't based on circumstances, but on the certainty that God is faithful and will fulfill his promises, even when everything around us suggests otherwise. Abraham then not only demonstrated what it meant to have faith in God, but also showed us what it means to persevere in faith. His faith wasn't just a moment of trust, but a continuous journey. And this journey of faith made him an example for all generations. Abraham's faith is a beacon for all of us, reminding us that, even in the most difficult trials, trusting in God will lead us to places we cannot imagine. Through Abraham's life, God calls us to have a faith that goes beyond visible circumstances, a faith based on trust in his character and his faithfulness. And this is the true significance of Abraham's faith. It inspires us to move forward with confidence, even without seeing all the details of the path ahead. The hot desert wind stirred the dust as Abraham walked slowly, alone, under the burning sun. It was a moment of deep silence, but in his mind, the promise God had made echoed. It wasn't just a promise for him and his descendants, but for something greater, a promise that would extend through generations, reaching all the nations of the earth. After the ultimate test of faith, where Abraham was challenged to sacrifice his own son, God gave him an even deeper revelation. The covenant he had established with Abraham wasn't just about physical descendants, but about an eternal plan that would touch all of humanity. God was planning something much greater: the restoration of the relationship between humanity and himself. When God told Abraham that his descendants would be a blessing for all nations, he wasn't speaking only about the Israelites, but about something much broader. God was revealing a plan of salvation that transcended the boundaries of a specific people and would reach every corner of the earth. It was a plan of redemption that would culminate in Jesus Christ, the promised Messiah, the Savior of all nations. At that moment, Abraham may not have fully understood the depth of this promise. He knew his descendants would be numerous and that a nation would arise from him, but he couldn't have imagined the global impact of his faith. Little did he know that through his lineage, the Messiah would come, bringing salvation not only to the Jews but to all people, all cultures, and races. God's covenant with Abraham was not limited to the promised land. It had cosmic implications, reaching into eternity. Through Jesus Christ, this covenant plan expanded to all believers. The promise made to Abraham, that all nations would be blessed through him, was fulfilled in a surprising way. Jesus, a descendant of Abraham, brought the true blessing, salvation and the possibility of a restored relationship with God. This blessing was not confined to those who were descendants of Abraham by blood, but extended to all who, by faith, accepted Christ as Savior. God's covenant with Abraham teaches us that from the very beginning, God's plan for humanity was always inclusive. He didn't just want to save one people, but all people. Through Abraham, he started the path to bring the blessing of salvation to all nations, paving the way for the coming of Christ, who would establish the true covenant between God and all people. It's fascinating to realize how God always had a global vision, one that transcended the barriers of time, space, and culture. The covenant with Abraham was a covenant of faith, a covenant of trust in God, and it found its perfect fulfillment in Christ. In his mercy, God invited Abraham to be part of this eternal plan. And by doing so, Abraham became an instrument of blessing, not just for the people of Israel, but for all peoples across all generations. Abraham, the father of faith, became the starting point for the greatest redemption story humanity has ever known. He didn't just receive the promise of a great lineage. He became part of a story of covenant that spans the centuries and culminates in the coming of Christ, the true blessing for all nations. Now we see how God's covenant with Abraham was a milestone not just in the history of the people of Israel, but for all humanity. The redemption plan that began with Abraham reached its peak with Jesus Christ, bringing salvation to all peoples. The story of Abraham teaches us about God's faithfulness, purpose, and unconditional love. If you enjoyed this video and want to continue following this journey of discoveries and lessons, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel. Leave your opinion in the comments. We want to know how this story impacted you. And of course, share this video with your friends so more people can understand God's plan for all humanity. We'll see you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring more stories that shape our faith and history. Until then,